は誰でも持っているみんなの心に持っている遥かな虫の過去から持っている
Shoko Asahara. For us in the West, this name means little. In Japan, however, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone unaware of this man and his cult, Shinrikyo. New religious movements and cults are not unique to Japan. They've grown enormously, providing spirituality to those lost in the new world of the 20th and 21st centuries. However, the conditions that created are indicative of Japanese society in the 20th century, drawing from their history, 20th century turmoil, and foreign influence on Japan at the time. And its founder, Shoko Asahara, were able to captivate a new Japanese generation into committing acts of horrendous terrorism. Shoko Asahara was born on March 2, 1955, to a very poor family in southern Japan, in rural Kyushu. Born blind in one eye and with only 30% vision in the other, he was far from destined for greatness. Asahara's parents, being as poor as they were, and already having another blind son, lied about his condition, claiming he was fully blind in order to send him to a subsidized school. Asahara's experience in this school shaped who he was. Being the only student with partial sight, he had substantial power over his classmates. With this being his first experience in holding power, Asahara did not hesitate in abusing it, quickly becoming the tyrant of his class. He relentlessly manipulated and bullied his peers into submission. He became the literal embodiment of the famous quote from 15th century Dutch humanist Erasmus, "In the country of blind, the one-eyed is king." The inflated ego that Asahara gained at this time inspired him to run for becoming the Japanese prime minister. And so he moved to Tokyo in 1978 to try to get into the prestigious Tokyo University, although he failed his entrance exam. Thus, Asahara explored a new avenue, selling traditional Chinese medicine in Tokyo. During his time selling Chinese herbs, Asahara had his first run-ins with the law. They never truly amounted to anything, but in 1984, as he began to get more interested in religion, Asahara opened a yoga studio with a profoundly religious theme, featuring himself as the guru. Asahara, perhaps even to his own surprise, was a very popular teacher. In the mid-1980s, as he was developing his ideas, his yoga studio became far more focused on spirituality. As such, Asahara took a trip to India in the Himalayas in 1987, and while there, he built his legend. He claims to have met with the god Shiva and the Dalai Lama. During this time, he reached his final enlightenment. Upon returning to Japan, he claimed that he had a special mission, and thus Shinrikyo turned from a spiritual yoga studio into a doomsday cult.
The city of Hiroshima lies prostrate after the withering blast which wiped out 53,000 of its population. 4 square miles of buildings leveled by the first of 2 small bombs that decided the fate of Japan.
For the Japanese people in the 20th century, the apocalypse never seemed out of sight. The very first half of the century was one of rapid industrialization and marked the end of their isolation period. That in itself could have been seen as the end days of the old country. Then, you add rapid military expansionism, colonialism, and ultimately the Pacific War. The Pacific War devastated Japan, with fire bombings of Tokyo and other major cities, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and wartime shortages. For the first time, the Japanese people could hear the voice of the emperor, see him standing, attempting to come close to the proud MacArthur. Here, he was dwarfed, and he was no god. Such rapid change created a post-war generation in desperate need of enlightenment. This generation, often called Shinjinri, or the New Generation, had a lot more foreign influence than any other generations previously. Thus, the old religions of Japan did not provide the spirituality that they desired. The result of this was a power vacuum where many new religious movements, or Shinshukyo, gained massive followings. Most were benign, providing alternatives to existing religions to answer the questions of the times that old religions could not. It should not be surprising, however, given the apocalyptic nature of Japan in the first half of the 20th century, that malignant movements with predictions of upcoming Armageddon would arise. It is the latter category that fits into. And upon Asahara's return from India, he brought visions of his personal deity, Shiva, destroying the world and only leaving followers alive. The Cold War also heavily influenced Asahara. Pairing this with the 20th century struggles of Japan, this made the idea of an upcoming apocalypse far more palatable for a Japanese audience. Was a highly syncretic religion. It was heavily influenced by many others. Much of this influence came from Buddhism, specifically the Tibetan sect. Meanwhile, Asahara's personal deity that he claimed to have met with was Shiva, the Hindu god. Asahara frequently drew comparisons between himself and the Lamb of God, needing to sacrifice himself as a martyr like Jesus, so that his followers could survive Armageddon. Developments like these would not have been possible in the old Japan, but the Shinjinri were not old, and they had a lot more foreign influence than any other generations prior. With so many new foreign influences, Shinrikyo drew on a young crowd eager to expose themselves to a foreign spirituality. Upon his return to Japan, Asahara got to work quickly. He and his most devout followers moved onto a commune. Most of these followers, however, did not live on this commune, as they lived regular lives and owned businesses. However, the money that these people made would go to funding this commune. Attracted new followers by embracing media popular in Japan at the time. There were anime, manga, and songs made by to present their ideas in a way popular with the youth. The younger generations were the backbone of the movement, with many recruits being young people interested in spiritualism while also being highly educated, coming from the country's top universities. These young, educated people contributed greatly to power, but they also caused their first problems with the law. In order to attract followers to its commune, drew on the power of history and attracted followers through the long obsolete practice of shuke. Shuke was a Japanese Buddhist tradition that involved leaving one's home to go live in a monastery. Many young people completed shuke and took money or wealth from their parents in order to gain access to the compound, because entrance came with a price. Shuke angered the parents of those who left, as not only did their children disappear, but so did their hard-earned money. This did not stop recruitment, though, and increasingly became powerful. With this, the public began to take notice. The first journalist to write about did so in a negative light, and instead of being passive and ignoring it, followers endlessly harassed the newspaper and reporter, causing even further media attention to be put onto Thus began the complicated relationship between and its journalists. Early reports of were primarily concerned with criticizing the youth who were joining their ranks. This focus was not on the actual substance of rather, merely to criticize the folly of the young. By criticizing the youth instead of the organization itself, the media only did more to galvanize the youth and attract more followers to The first death to occur as a result of came as a shock. In 1988, a 21-year-old follower died from cardiac arrest following a 24-hour sleep-deprived meditation session. Shinrikyo routinely used sleep deprivation, oxygen deprivation, and the use of psychoactive drugs in order to induce spiritual experiences from its members, but never before had anyone died. This death shook Asahara, who became increasingly infatuated with the concept of death. This fascination came as Asahara became increasingly hermetic, sitting for long hours at a time, leaving his disciples to do the exercises that he once used to control for himself. This new infatuation prompted him to introduce a new idea into the idea of Phawa. Phawa came from the Tibetan Buddhism and had often been meant as a variety of things throughout history. In this context of Phawa is enabling the killing of people, with bad karma by those with good. Many former followers said when asked why they didn't leave when things began to become violent, that they subconsciously or intentionally ignored the signs of violence, because they didn't want to leave and end their spiritual experiences. In 1989, a group of disgruntled parents hired an attorney to prosecute and reclaim their children, though they'd already probably been in their 20s, as well as to reclaim the assets that their children had given them. On November 4th, 1989, the attorney, a man named Sakamoto Tsutsumi, his wife, and his infant son were found missing from their house, with blood streaming all over the walls and the Shinrikyo badges all over the scene. The police never mounted a full investigation into the matter, yet in 1995, arrested Shinrikyo leaders confessed to the murder of the three. It is believed that if a full investigation had been mounted, would have been found out, Asahara would have been prosecuted, and this video never would have escalated further. However, they got away. With Shinrikyo gaining more members and even more wealth, Asahara's ego inflated even further. His next move was to run in the 1990 Japanese elections. Despite thinking he had a shot, Shinrikyo failed miserably, winning 0 seats. This loss enraged Asahara so much that he deemed the whole Japanese population were deserving of Fawa, with the exception of his followers. This development drastically changed the stance of Aum. No longer would they wait for Armageddon, but now they would try to bring it about themselves. With the university graduates in their ranks, aided by contacts with weapon dealers in the post-Soviet Russia, Aum began procuring conventional and chemical weapons. Asahara and his followers were obsessed with the idea of procuring a nuclear bomb. While unable to build one, the scientists in Aum developed weapons such as sarin, anthrax, and cyanide. Aum began a series of assassinations against political opponents in the 90s, and in 1993, they would bring about their first attempt for doomsday. They sprayed anthrax spores out of a chimney in the factory in Tokyo. This plan failed, but it was accompanied by far more attempts, complemented with occasional attacks using sarin. The attacks and the large amount of weapon acquisitions did not go unnoticed. The police were closing in on them. With mounting pressure, Aum were desperate to act and initiated a grand finale. On March 20th, 1995, the members of Aum Shinrikyo released sarin gas in the Tokyo subway system during morning rush hour traffic. In total, 14 people were killed, a further 5,510 injured, 1,050 of whom seriously. The resulting aftermath was shock and horror. Such violence hadn't been witnessed since the Pacific War within Japan, and even worse, it was carried out by some of their brightest youth. The idea that Japan had built since the Pacific War of being a country free from violent crime was shattered on that day. Journalists had a field day with the story, and the attack remained on the top news stories for months afterwards. An astonishing 77% of households in Japan tuned into the live arrest of Shoko Asahara on May 16, 1995. The event wholeheartedly captured the attention of Japanese people, quickly becoming a cultural phenomenon. People wrote into news stations asking for more Aum Shinrikyo content, despite daily front-page headlines. An 81-year-old living in a retirement home wrote, "I hate television, but Aum programs are an exception. Every morning I check the TV schedule for Aum programs and mark them in red pencil. In the home for the elderly where I live, news and documentaries aren't very popular. But, if you'll excuse the expression, Aum programs are like watching a mystery by Edogawa Ranpo. Even as we are horrified, we're having a lot of fun." Aum was a story the weight of which Japan had seldom seen since the Pacific War. Even more so over their entire history. Shoko Asahara was sentenced to death in a highly publicized trial, dubbed the Trial of the Century by the Japanese media. Though imprisoned, Aum Shinrikyo continues without Asahara. Though a shadow of its former self, on New Year's Day in 2019, a follower of Shoko Asahara intentionally drove his car into a crowd in Tokyo, injuring 9. Though it's been 28 years since the infamous attacks in 1995, their memory lives on in Japanese culture. As evidenced by the YouTube clips shown, the impact this has had on Japanese collective memory is huge. Even people born after this event have grown up in its shadow. By studying the creation and history of Aum Shinrikyo, we are able to gain a profound understanding of the worries and trends of Japanese society and the culture in the late 20th century.